feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place.
Welcome to the Yongle Lin School of Medicine Healthy Longevity webinar series. I'm back today, taking over from Andrea Meyer, and I'm coming to you live from Copenhagen, Denmark, where we're having the Aging Research and Drug Discovery 2021 conference. It's amazing to be actually in a real-life conference again. And also to be in Europe for a while. I think that we're hearing a lot of exciting stuff about aging research, and there'll be a lot of people at this conference that'll be future speakers on the webinar. I want to remind you to use the Q&A function today to ask questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. We also have a great speaker, Tyler Golato, today, and I'll be introducing him in a minute. But first, I want to bring on Indrik Wijaha, one of my people in my lab, who's going to tell you about a recent paper on how the microbiome from young mice can affect age-associated behavioral deficits.
Thank you, Brian. As Brian has mentioned, I'm Indrik Wijaya, a research assistant from Prof. Brian Kennedy's lab. And today, I'll be sharing to you an intriguing research done by John Cryne's group from University College Cork, Ireland, which was published in Nature Aging recently. This study raised the fascinating possibility that manipulation of the gut microbiota could counteract or even reverse age-associated cognitive and behavioral impairments. This paper is significant as it provides the first experimental evidence in mammals that fecal microbiota transplantation, FMT, from young into old mice can help to restore aging-associated immune and brain impairments. As such, the findings from this paper open up the possibilities in the future to modulate gut microbiota as a therapeutic target to influence brain health. The team treated old mice with young FMT and examined how this impacted their immune system and brain function, including cognitive behaviors. They controlled for this with old mice given old microbiota and young mice treated with young FMT as well. Impressively, just a bit of youthful poo was able to restore a lot of aspects in old mice. For instance, it's able to restore metabolites, to restore the enlargement of microglial inflammations, as well as restore altered behaviors in old mice. And the first thing the team noticed was that the gut microbiomes of the old mice given young FMT began to resemble those of the younger ones. For instance, the common gut microbiome Enterococcus, which are already used as prebiotics to improve animal health, became much more abundant in old mice given this young FMT. The authors then examined whether or not the gut microbiota from the young mice could have any influence over host immunity in the old mice. They observed that young FMT reversed the aging-induced increase in early activated CD8 plus cells and CD103 plus dendritic cells. Conversely, young FMT failed to reverse the aging-associated reduction in circulating levels of cytokines. This observation suggests that young FMT into an old host selectively modulates peripheral immunity, and thus restoring some aspects of peripheral immunity. The group also looked at the hippocampus, which is critical to learning and memory, and which declines in function with age. In the hippocampi of all mice, microglial cells, a type of immune cells in the brain, had enlarged cell bodies characteristic of neurodegenerative conditions. They noticed that young FMT into an old mice reversed this phenotype. Using metabolomics in the hippocampus to better characterize what is happening, the authors found many metabolites were restored following young FMT treatment, such as retinol or vitamin A. A previous study has shown that vitamin A supplementation prevents age-related spatial memory deficits. Of these restored metabolites, 35 were enriched in 6 pathways, predominantly related to amino acid metabolism and amino acid tRNA biosynthesis, which are essential to proper brain function. Lastly, the authors also assessed a variety of different behavioral tasks, such as learning and memory with the mice given young FMT. They discovered that these mice learned and remembered how to navigate a water maze as well as, or nearly as well as, young mice. For instance, old mice given young FMT showed reduction in mean distance from the platform on training days 4 and 5, and paralleled young FMT mice in average path length and average velocity. To sum up, the study finds that fecal microbiota transplantation from young mice into old mice leads to a couple of things. Firstly, reversion of aging-invoked immune alterations in peripheral immune cells, reversions of age-related enlargement in microglia size, restoration of altered hippocampal metabolites, and rescuing of aging-associated cognitive decline. Here are some takeaways that I hope you have enjoyed from this presentation. Number 1, microbiome can be harnessed to reverse age-related brain deterioration, improve learning ability, and cognitive function. And lastly, modulating gut microbiota as a therapeutic target for brain aging is a very potential thing to do to improve brain health as we are growing old. Even though it is not possible to change our genome, it is possible to change our microbiome. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. And now I would like to pass the time back to Brian. Thank you.
Thanks, Hendrik. We're doing a lot of clinical studies looking at interventions to see which ones affect human longevity and a range of age-related phenotypes. And I'm curious whether we could get volunteers for fecal microbiome transplants. So if you're out there listening, would you volunteer for a study like that or not? So you can let us know in the chat. And while you're doing that, you can listen to Tyler Golato, who's the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Molecule, a platform to facilitate decentralized, modular, and collaborative drug development, which is an exciting thing. He's also a co-initiator of VitaDAO, which is a decentralized collective funding mechanism using blockchain technology to support aging research. And he's going to tell us about that today. We're excited to hear his talk, which is VitaDAO, Decentralized Funding for Longevity Research. Thanks for joining the show, Tyler.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's really a pleasure to be here. Great. So again, my name is Tyler Golato, and I'm a biochemist by training. But for the past few years, I've been working in the context of an area that I think is really interesting for the future of drug development in general. And this is really focused on bringing decentralized technologies to help assist in the funding and governance of drug development research very generally. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about, let's say, one of the first real world proof of concepts that are using some of the technologies that have been developed over the past few years in the decentralization space to really help fund and govern longevity research specifically. So VitaDAO is a project at a very high level that is focused on trying to bring communities together to help fund, commercialize, and further the cause of longevity research. Before I get into sort of the meat and bones of my talk, I want to discuss a couple of terms that are somewhat intrinsic to, let's say, a key understanding of what a DAO is or what these organizations actually do. I think terms like cryptocurrency and blockchain are come with quite a lot of stigma and quite a lot of misunderstanding. So I'm going to try and really simplify these things, not necessarily from a technical perspective, but just so that we have a shared understanding of what these technologies can actually be used for. So when I refer to decentralization, what I'm referring to specifically is the transfer of control from one activity or one organization to many stakeholders as opposed to a single one. And this illustration on the right side of my screen here sort of shows what that looks like. When we think about a centralized entity, there's a sort of a single point of failure or a single point of authority around which everything is built. And in a decentralized structure or a decentralized organization, there's some level of redundancy that means that no single individual or no single player can exert a large amount of control on this system. And that's a pretty powerful concept because it means that effectively, it becomes very difficult for any player to exert a lot of force or dominate a system or overpower it. Blockchains themselves are decentralized systems. They're peer-to-peer networks that instead of having centralized authority, rely on typically networks that are global, computer networks, and allow users to interact with each other through this decentralized network. There's many examples of blockchains, and there's many, let's say, different use cases for blockchain technology. The most sort of, let's say, obvious one would be cryptocurrency networks and engaging in financial exchanges. But blockchains are also really powerful tools for other things, such as identity verification or optimizing supply chains. And in today's context, we're really going to be thinking about blockchains that help basically create decentralized governance around an organization. And a cryptocurrency is simply a digital currency or a token that allows transactions to occur on a specific blockchain. If I think about the Ethereum network, for example, being a blockchain, Ether is the currency that is used to transact in that network. Speaking of Ethereum, one of the real innovations that have happened in the blockchain space over the past 5 years were the popularization and creation of smart contracts, which move blockchains from being simply a decentralized ledger to something that you can actually program and something that is capable of running basically small software applications. And at its most basic level, you can think of a smart contract as basically a self-enforceable representation of a real-world contract. And just to illustrate what that means, if I can create, with a smart contract, I could say to you, I'm interested in you providing me with a specific data set. And if you provide me with that data set, I will pay you $10, for example. In this case, using a smart contract, you can code that interaction so that when you upload this data, it'll basically be verified. And if it meets certain criteria or certain conditions, that $10 that I promised you will be released. So there's a trustless aspect to it. It doesn't need to be mediated by an individual or a party. It's basically technology that's mediating these interactions. And smart contracts are the basis on which most projects on Ethereum are actually built. They bring programmability into blockchains and change what you can do from basically, let's say, engaging in a series of financial interactions to a much higher degree of complexity in terms of what you can do with blockchain technology. And finally, I think the most important thing for this talk and the sort of reason for explaining these various terms is to understand what is a DAO, what is a decentralized autonomous organization. In some ways, this is currently the most complex implementation of a smart contract, where basically the rules or the laws of a specific organization are actually codified using smart contracts. These use tokens to basically the cryptocurrency to allow people to vote on decisions and make proposals. And in essence, it's a decentralized collective, typically with a common goal. So there are DAOs for many different things, but you can think about this as an organization, a membership organization containing people from all over the world who are coming together with a common interest, where instead of having a sort of top-down hierarchy like a company might, instead, it consists of a global community of decentralized contributors where the laws of that organization are sort of decided by everybody and voted by everybody, and again, are mediated by technology in a trustless way via smart contracts as opposed to having a CEO, a manager, et cetera, sort of explaining what needs to be done or delegating work. So it's really in many ways a very exciting development. It's a new form of organization. And there are a lot of people who believe in some ways this might be really the future of work. So with that in mind, the DAO space has really been maturing a lot over the past 3 or 4 years. And what you had seen previously with DAOs were a lot of what I would refer to as DAOs that really worked in a way that was contained within the crypto space. It might have been a DAO for a community of software developers or engineers sharing resources, or a DAO that was funding cryptocurrency projects. But what has really happened recently is that the tooling and software to create a DAO has advanced in such a way that we can begin applying this technology to sort of touch points outside of the crypto space. And so with that in mind, I would ask the question, what is the single most impactful thing that a DAO could do with $1 million or tens of million dollars today? And in my personal view, that would be furthering the cause of longevity research and helping move the needle on human health span. And so with this in mind, a group of people over the past year have really been trying to create a community that is focused on exactly this goal. And that community is called VitaDAO. VitaDAO is a decentralized collective that's focused on funding early stage longevity research with a core mission to extend human health span and lifespan by researching, financing, and helping to commercialize longevity therapeutics in an open, accessible, and democratic manner. And what's interesting about this is that VitaDAO and its members are committed to basically nurturing the projects that it helps fund and bringing them closer to market and closer to the clinic. So in exchange for the funding that this DAO provides, research projects typically give some percentage or even in many cases, all of the intellectual property that results from the projects to this community, which is then collectively focused on bringing this to just basically furthering it, whether it's through co-development deals, whether it's by bringing it into the clinic with certain partners, or whether it's by getting it to the point that this early academic research can be out-licensed or have a company created around it, et cetera. And so specifically, the gap that VitaDAO is focused on filling is what is referred to as the translational gap, or the valley of death in drug development. If we think about the process of bringing a therapeutic from the point of discovery to market, there are a series of things that need to happen. In many cases, grant funding, so what you would get from the NIH if you were a researcher in the United States, for example, is well positioned to help basic research be carried out. It's well positioned in some cases to help drug discovery. But once you get to the point of actually creating something that might be considered a product or a commercializable drug, as an academic, you have a certain number of options. You can patent this technology and it can then go live within a tech transfer office until a pharmaceutical company licenses it. You could create a startup, for example, but in many cases, it becomes harder to get funding for something that is clearly becoming commercial. And so our goal is actually to provide funding to academics that are working on early stage longevity drug development and to really help bridge this valley of gap. And by doing so in a way that is higher risk and earlier stage than many VCs or startups would be focused on. From an ecosystem perspective, I'll just try to explain at sort of the macro level how this organization actually functions and how it operates. So basically, anyone who's interested can join VitaDAO, and there are two distinct ways of doing that. The first way is by providing funding to the organization. And in exchange for that funding, members would receive tokens, this cryptocurrency in essence, that allows them to vote and make proposals for the organization as a whole. So in exchange for their funding, what they're basically getting are governance rights over the organization, over its projects. Similarly, members can join by contributing work. So if you're an academic, if you're somebody that has, for example, let's say a background in DNA damage and repair, and you want to help serve the VitaDAO community by evaluating projects that are focused on DNA damage and repair, you can join VitaDAO and for your time and for your effort, receive tokens that allow you to participate in governance as well. With the funding that this entity raises, it can do a couple of things, but the primary thing that it does is basically distribute that funding to laboratories that have research projects that sort of fit this early stage preclinical proof of concept. And in exchange for that funding, the laboratory basically commits to providing its data and the intellectual property that results out of its project to this collective, which again is then governed by these members. Over time, VitaDAO can decide what to do with these assets and with these projects. The community could decide to open source it and make it available to anyone. They can decide to commercialize it. They can decide to out-license it to a third party. But the long-term goal is to actually create a sort of circular economy where VitaDAO's, the entity's investments into longevity projects become a sustainable source of funding for longevity research. So it's basically over time to get to the point where VitaDAO as an entity itself has longevity to really continue these sort of funding events. And one of the really interesting ways that a DAO on the Ethereum blockchain, basically, if we want to ask ourselves, how does a DAO on the Ethereum blockchain, this sort of jurisdictionless entity, actually hold intellectual property? It does so through NFTs, basically through what are called non-fungible tokens. You've probably heard about these in the context of the art space, the music space recently, but non-fungible tokens are basically just a token or almost like a cryptocurrency, except that it's unique, it's non-fungible, so it's not non-divisible, and it can represent a real world asset. So my company Molecule has basically been building this infrastructure for the past couple of years, and it allows anyone to attach a research project, basically data sets, patents, contract research agreements, sponsored research agreements, to an NFT and allow this to be held by a DAO. So a little bit about how this organization actually came to life and was bootstrapped in essence. We applied what are called fair launch principles in the crypto space. Basically, we held a batch auction for 10% of the entire token supply, so roughly 6.4 million tokens. These tokens went to in a batch auction where anyone could come and say, they were interested in purchasing some tokens. They could set a sort of price threshold. And at the end of this auction, at the closing, these sort of orders are filled from the highest price backwards, and everyone ends up getting in at more or less the same price. So, or actually at exactly the same price. So basically the community, the people who seeded VitaDAO, got to decide how much the token was worth and ultimately how much funding VitaDAO would have initially to begin its mission. And even the team that built this, myself included, at this point didn't have any tokens in the project. The only individuals who had any control over this organization to govern it were basically the initial community that provided it funding. And then they can pass proposals to allocate funding or, let's say, remuneration to the teams that build this, the developers that work on it, et cetera. So it's really, there's a certain exercise of trust in creating these things, that you create a community that is really strongly aligned and create basically a launch that is really fair for the people who want to support this project. And at present, VitaDAO has, I think, roughly between $7 and $8 million that it will be deploying into longevity research over the next years before raising additional funding, which it can do by selling further tokens or by actually commercializing some of its early investments. And currently there's between 500 and 600 active VitaDAO token holders, and the community itself, if we look at the let's say Discord community and the people who are following the project, there's roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people. So in a period of, I would say, roughly 4 months, this community has grown quite a bit, is quite decentralized. We have people from all over the world who are actively participating and contributing every day. So why crypto and longevity? So for those who follow the crypto space, I think you might be aware that some of the key opinion leaders like Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum, or Balaji, who is the former CTO of Coinbase, have been really vocal proponents of longevity research. And Balaji once said that longevity has the potential to be to traditional medicine what crypto is to traditional finance. It really changes the terms of the debate. So I think if we think about longevity as sort of a new way to approach medicine, as a preventative paradigm that's focused more on maintaining health as opposed to treating disease, Crypto has a sort of similar thinking when it comes to traditional finance. It's trying to create a paradigm shift in terms of how we think about money and traditional finance. Both have been somewhat dismissed by the incumbents due to their high-risk nature. I would say that both aging research and crypto have become increasingly mainstream over the past couple of years. There's been a lot of progress made, but maybe 30 years ago, before the Human Genome Project, for example, aging was really considered to be experimentally intractable. So a lot is changing over time, and I think these communities are actually incredibly aligned. And the sort of goal here is to align the most forward-thinking economically with the most forward-thinking scientifically. If we look at different fields that have minted, let's say, the most new millionaires and new billionaires over the past couple of years, it's certainly the crypto space. And because of that, there are a number of high net worth individuals in the space that really want to begin to do something impactful with their wealth. Instead of just doing yield farming and things like that, there are a lot of people now who say, I have this money, how can I put it to good use? And there's a really strong interest in the longevity space because of this. So again, what is unique about VitaDAO as an organization? It basically owns the intellectual property assets that results from its projects. It's open and decentralized. Anyone can join the organization and get involved, which again is very different from how a company works or a VC works. VitaDAO typically provides funding up to about $250,000. With some exceptions, if it's a particularly promising project, the community could vote to allocate more funding than that, for example. There's a focus on very early stage, high risk, high reward longevity projects, and it tries to make funding decisions somewhat rapidly, so in 2 to 3 weeks. But ultimately, the primary differentiator between this and really any other organization that's working as a funding body in the longevity space is the sort of decentralized community that's behind it. So it's currently a community of researchers, PhDs, postdocs, enthusiasts, anyone that just has a basal interest in the longevity space. And I think as a researcher, this is something that's really interesting, right? So you can have the opportunity, instead of having your work funded by a grant organization or by a VC, all of a sudden there's this open community that you have the ability to engage, to get feedback from, and to have really a lot more attention on your work than you might otherwise, working with a more opaque and a more, let's say, monolithic organization. The structure of VitaDAO is quite interesting because there's a certain level of engineering involved when creating these frameworks to basically optimize for the end goal. So if the end goal is how do we advance longevity research, there are a couple of questions and a couple of skills that are required within the community. So at one layer, you have members, which are basically just anyone that holds the Vita token. And these are people that can actively participate in governance via proposals. And then you have another tier, which are the sort of working groups. And what working groups do is basically provide guidance and expertise to the broader community of token holders. And they're the people who are actually typically dedicating their time and effort to the DAO in exchange for Vita, as opposed to funding. And so the working groups themselves are stratified across a series of domains. There is legal, which consists of legal experts and lawyers from all over the world that are helping work on the intellectual property, on licenses, et cetera. There's technical, which is the broader developer community, the people who actually code the smart contracts, who create the user interface, because this is ultimately a software platform that this is running by. There's the governance working group, which is tasked with basically all questions around how the entity is governed, if there's any issues with proposals, dealing with things like soft governance. So what can be decided by the community without needing to actually do a formal vote. There's the tokenomics and economics working group, which helps work on the incentives, remuneration, how people are essentially paid in the organization that contribute work, for example. There's sort of the awareness. This group also works on helping educate the community about longevity and about the goals of the organization. And then there's the basic operations working group, which really helps make sure that the DAO is running smoothly. But the most important and the one that's really at the core of the project is what we call the longevity working group, which at the moment consists of about 40 domain-specific experts, again, PhDs, postdocs, medical doctors, key opinion leaders from the longevity space, who basically serve the job of doing due diligence, evaluating, and helping source projects. So Just because I might have an enthusiast level interest in longevity doesn't mean that I have the ability to really evaluate a project, right? And this is a problem that needs solving for in the context of these organizations. So what we've done is basically created this working group that provides expertise to token holders on what sort of projects meet a certain level of scientific rigor. They basically provide application reviews. They handle all of the incoming requests for projects and then make recommendations, in essence, to the token holders on what projects they believe should be voted on. But at the end of the day, they don't actually have any sort of executive power. They ultimately serve to help the community make decisions. And the sort of third tier are service providers. So these are real world companies or organizations that provide services for the DAO in exchange for payment. This could be a law firm, for example, a contract research organization, et cetera. And so just to help sort of drive this home and make it a bit more visual, I'm going to walk you through how the DAO actually functions and how it operates. The first level of communication, and where a lot of, let's say, the ideation and conversation occurs, is on a platform called Discord, which is somewhat similar to Slack. I think it was originally created for the gaming community, but has been largely adopted into crypto and also by more traditional organizations as an interesting way to work. We have sort of an open general community that anyone can join, a longevity lounge where people can discuss projects, and also a general chat, which you can't see, it's up here, but I think this is it opened here. And then there are a series of working groups, which I mentioned briefly, and also some internal working groups as well for things like deal flow, legal, et cetera. And so these are all basically forum channels that people can post in or join, for example. And this is where most of the basic conversation, the day-to-day, let's say, discussions around VitaDAO occur. It's very stream of consciousness. It's not particularly organized. It's obviously a little bit chaotic. There's almost 2,000 people that are part of this. But this is where people are able to ideate and have conversations around everything related to Vita and within the working groups as well. The second tier is really this platform called Discourse, which is a little bit more formal. This is basically where early stage proposals are created. Basically, as a member, I can come in here, I can propose something to the organization, and I can say, for example, let's hire a technical lead to lead the technical working group. Let's create a new incentive proposal. Let's decide to add additional liquidity to the token, or let's establish an accounting and financing framework. This is really interesting because, again, this organization is coming together by a community of decentralized contributors, right? It's not a company with a particular hierarchy. So over time, the organization is constantly iterating, constantly forming, and beginning to implement structures that come in the form of proposals from this actual community that has been seeded. And after this, so if there is a proposal that comes onto this platform, it's discussed on this forum, people leave comments, people have sort of a soft vote. And if that proposal is successful and garners enough support from the community, you go to this third phase, which is ultimately the very core of the DAO. This is where your tokens, Vita tokens, are used to basically vote yes or no on a proposal that will ultimately become law for the organization. So recently we funded our first research project ever, which was with Morten Schaubye-Knudsen at the University of Copenhagen. This proposal passed with, I believe there were a little over 2 million votes. So I'm not sure how many individuals that was, but those were the total number of tokens that were actually staked for vote. 88% voted yes. And ultimately that codified that this project would receive $250,000 in funding. So this is really how things go from sort of, there's this process from ideation, from very early stage, hey, this project looks interesting, to, hey, I'm going to propose this. I think we should fund this. There's a robust conversation on that. The working groups self-evaluate the project, and then this goes on the platform, and token holders basically say, yes, we want to pass this, or no, we don't want to fund this. And this can happen beyond, let's say, this can happen with anything related to the DAO, not simply just what projects are funded. It could also be, hey, we want to, I don't know, for example, we want to try to attract an additional 500 members, or we want to, let's say, mint another 10% of the token supply. You can make proposals to do that. And if there's support, you have the ability to execute on it if the community is behind it. One of the final things I wanted to touch on is really how the DAO holds IP, which I mentioned earlier. And this is an interesting challenge because, again, a DAO is a jurisdictionless vehicle that lives on the Ethereum blockchain. It's not a company with an address, right? So how do we actually do this? And it's really by taking licenses, agreements, contracts, patents, and figuring out a way to make them natively digital so they can actually be held by a smart contract. And this is really a framework that Molecule has been pioneering over the past several years, which basically allows any sort of legal document related to intellectual property to be attached to an NFT and held by a DAO. And this is a fundraising mechanism that will be utilized outside of the context of VitaDAO. It will be utilized hopefully by universities and other DAOs and other organizations to help make IP more transactable, more liquid, and more easy to interact in and due diligence even in a digital way. So finally, how can you get involved? Again, we work via Discord. The community is open for anyone to join. You can join the working groups as well, for example. If you have a couple hours a week to dedicate and are a researcher, you'll be compensated for your help. And this is really at the core of how the DAO functions and grows. If you're a researcher, we are actively looking for longevity projects to fund, particularly those that are beginning to have some sort of commercial focus, or at least where there's some commercial potential. This could be anything from early stage drug development to biomarker creation to diagnostics and beyond. So it's very simple. You can go on our website and click apply. It's a very short application, and we would love to have a conversation with you to discuss your work and figure out how we can help. And then I would say for those that are a bit more technically ambitious, the DAO space is blossoming. I had a conversation with someone the other day that's creating a terraforming DAO. There's people that have aerospace engineering focused DAOs. The space is really young, but there's a lot of movement in it. And I think we're at the very beginning of seeing what is possible with DAOs. And then ongoing challenges. So this is, I think someone said to me a few weeks ago that if you work in a DAO, it becomes somewhat clear how bureaucracies form and why company structures exist. So for all of the things that are that you can't do with a company that you can do with a DAO, there's also many engineering challenges. How do you coordinate a community of 2,000 people to get a task done? How do you organize your let's say, or create accountability in DAOs for decentralized contributors? How do you align a large group of people around a common goal? So a lot of this comes from, I think, trial and error and basically iterating on what works and what doesn't. We hope to simplify our onboarding process to help people get involved more quickly. I think it's really important that our cultural practices and the sense of community continues to build and improve. And then really trying to integrate some of the experiences of lean startups, for example, with DAO practices. And again, trying to bridge these two worlds of crypto and biotech. And what I see as one of the biggest challenges and one of the most important is really building reputation beyond the crypto space. So to become seen as legitimate in the eyes of the longevity space, and for people to no longer think about, let's say, think about this as a crypto organization, but rather to see this as a funding body in the longevity space or community in the longevity space that is simply using crypto as a toolkit in the background. And with that, I wanted to thank you for listening, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Tyler. That was great. And I think it raises a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions on the chat too. Before we start into this though, I'm always curious to ask people because people that are doing biomedical research have a lot of different avenues toward your career path. So how did you get from the bench to doing what you're doing now?
So I started out my career thinking that I wanted to be a physician. I was living in the United States at the time and sort of pursued that. I started working in hospitals initially as a nurse aide. I studied biochemistry. And one of the things that I saw that bothered me to a certain extent were sort of the barriers that existed to access in healthcare in the United States. So I was actually doing an internship in sort of oncology. And one of the things that I saw that was really shocking were that we were doing experimental clinical trials. And if someone didn't meet the inclusion criteria for a clinical trial, and they also didn't have health insurance, in some cases, they would actually be turned away from the hospital because cancer isn't considered to be an acute emergency, for example.
Yeah.
And this bothered me a lot. And I think I initially dealt with that by going into research and thinking that like maybe I could help push the field forward. I was a bit frustrated also with oncology in general, because I felt that it was, this is how I became interested in longevity. I felt like our focus on individual cancers in a very siloed way was almost costing us progress in general. We, instead of thinking about like, medicine's becoming increasingly personalized. We're focusing on, single mutations in the context of a specific tumor, but we're sort of losing the bigger picture. So I became interested in longevity research. I think I realized, I worked at the National Institute on Aging, and I think through that realized that we were still quite a ways away from the clinic, and just realized that there are actually a lot of barriers for drug development that go beyond the science. So I think I became really interested in sort of thinking about, let's say, this entire system, and how could I utilize my skills or my career to make a difference that would actually have an impact on the entire space rather than on a single disease area, or if I pursued the PhD path, maybe spending my career working on a single gene or something like this. And I early on was I would say a crypto skeptic. I'm not a person who like drank the Kool-Aid early on, but I had
sorry to hear that.
yeah, exactly. I had about 3.5 years ago, I met my business partner at Molecule, Paul Kohlhaas, who came from a sort of a very deep crypto background. He had been in the space since like 2014. He was one of the first employees at Consensus. He had built blockchain development house, and also spent a lot of time really passionate about the biopharma space and wanting to change sort of the perverse incentives, particularly in the United States, that sort of permeate the pharmaceutical industry. And we began to have some conversations around how these emerging decentralized technologies could actually have an impact on how drug development is governed and how it's funded. And the sort of key thesis was, what would it look like if diabetics, for example, were collectively owning and governing insulin? What would it look like if, let's say, someone that had a particular cancer phenotype, a group of patient advocates or a group of patients actually owned and therefore governed the intellectual property that was related to their disease, as opposed to a pharmaceutical company? And so we began to engineer experiments in the space on that basis, trying to figure out if this was a way that could conceivably, sort of move the needle in any of these areas. And I would say VitaDAO is the first example of this being quite live, quite public, and quite open. So getting to a point where we've been confident enough with the sort of technologies and our understanding of the space that we could say like, okay, let's really do this and see if it works.
I think that part of this is bringing a lot of academics and other people who don't know about cryptocurrency into this scheme. And so one of the things you hear one of the things people think when they hear cryptocurrency is unstable, fluctuating valuations. How does VitaDAO deal with this concern?
Yeah, so I think initially the goal is, again, the primary function of the token within the context that we're talking about it here is as a governance token. It's not actually meant to be an exchange of value, in that it's not supposed to be a token that someone buys and holds and speculates on. The token actually has a utility or a function. And this is one key thing that really differentiates, let's say, the token economy that's being created in crypto from, let's say, the more traditional cryptocurrency space. There are a lot of projects that exist in essence to pump a token price. You know what I mean? This is something that I think also has been a barrier to legitimacy in the space, because people just see this sort of this very speculative market that's up and down. Where we're particularly interested is not necessarily in the, of course, there's always, we're trying to fund drug development. So there is a financial component to this, but the utility of the token is really for governance. And I think the idea is that over time, if VitaDAO is successful in its goals, if it begins to build this portfolio of longevity projects and actively deploys funding in the correct ways, the community that it begins to attract is one that has a similar goal and a similar vision. And the sort of value that's gained through that is not necessarily through speculating on a token. It's really, hey, we're actually making an impact in the longevity space. So one of the things that we've tried to do is really discourage, we didn't do any marketing with this project. We really try to actively discourage speculation, and it's really a community building exercise, right? So the VitaDAO token price has been remarkably stable because there's not a big community of people speculating on it. It's a community that's mostly mission and vision aligned. Obviously that, there's only a certain extent that you can try to control that. It's an open project and join, but but something that we've been quite thoughtful about.
So you're going to have to get licensed IP from rights, at least from universities for projects. So tech transfer offices and universities are not always the most nimble. How's your experience been so far with that issue?
Really interesting. I mean, I would say that one thing that's funny to me about tech transfer offices is like the level of like technophobia in some cases, or like being some like the innovation offices can be somewhat adverse to innovation if it's new, which is, I mean, fair enough. I think they're engineered to be stable and somewhat slow moving in a sense. But I think in Europe, there's been a remarkable willingness to cooperate, explore these new sort of vehicles. Something like, again, we're using what we call IP NFTs. These are basically something that we can take a stock standard sponsored research agreement from a university or their licensing terms and actually attach them to the NFT. So we're not forcing them to work in a new way, and some of the technical complexity is really abstracted away from them. I would say in the States, it's been maybe a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, I think if we were doing this a year ago, it would have been more challenging, but surprisingly, I mean, I spoke at a conference that Autumn held, which is like the largest organization of tech transfer offices in the United States, and they asked us to speak there about NFTs. So all of these things are becoming more and more mainstream and more understood. That's not to say that it's completely mainstream and easy yet. Of course, it's still a challenge, and every time we speak to a TTO, there's also this like educational component that's really important, I think, to winning people over, but it's becoming easier and easier.
I think another thing that comes to mind is that these are early stage projects, and if you're going to get something through clinical trials, there's a lot of zeros involved in that, and maybe more than you can handle, in the context of VitaDAO, at least in current thinking. So you're going to have to then turn around and partner with pharmaceutical companies or somebody with deep pockets to try to get those projects done. So I doubt you're at that stage yet, but how are you thinking about that?
Yeah. So I mean, what's interesting here is that, again, as you mentioned rightfully, we're focusing on a very early stage of the market, where it's also typically not even the stage that someone would be out licensing a technology yet from a university. And for that reason, it's easier and easier to work with universities. Where it becomes difficult, again, is when you get into, let's say, capital requirements that are tens of millions, hundreds of billions in some cases. And I think you're absolutely right. What we'll need to do is either look at co-development, look at out licensing to larger players. But this is, in essence, to be decided by the community, the way this happens, right? So what my preference would be is one small part of this organization would be that if we are to work with pharmaceutical companies, which invariably I think we will if these projects are going to be successful, that the community is still able to play some role in how these things evolved, how they come to market, and how they're governed. And I think that's something that will happen quite slowly. I think that changing the pharmaceutical industry and the way that it works requires a lot of time. It doesn't happen quickly. The life cycle of drug development is 10 to 12 years. Yeah. So and it's something that we're really exploring. So I mean, we're in conversations via Molecule, for example. We had initially set up our offices quite early in Basel. We were engaging large pharmaceutical companies and trying to understand their appetite for, let's say, having a greater level of governance on behalf of patients or communities. And at surface level, they seem somewhat open to these ideas. What's really interesting in the US is, for example, that the pharmaceutical industry has a lower public perception than the arms industry. So there is certainly like a PR problem that exists for pharma. And I think it's reasonable to think that there are organizations that want to change that and that want to do things differently.
I agree with that. I hope there are. I had one more thought, which is escaping my mind. I think that, I know. So a lot of longevity funds and VCs have started recently. And one of the things they all say is that they're going to help academics with ideas, develop projects that, and this is true, a lot of times academics don't know what they don't know about pursuing commercial interest, either through a startup or through developing IP. How do you work with the projects you fund moving forward to sort of fill in those gaps that academics often need?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really via that same mechanism. So what we have beyond the broader token holder community are many researchers, many people with a background in VC, people from company building companies, there's probably a community of over 50 or 60 people that have been actively involved in building biotechs, of making the transition from academia to industry. It's the same sort of advice that I think you might be able to get from a VC, although I would argue that it's potentially even a larger community. And the goal here is to really leverage that community very actively to help academics, because you're absolutely right. I mean, it's particularly in the early stages, it's unlikely that a person really knows what the sort of case for intellectual property is around the project. If there is one, it's very unlikely that they know the sort of commercial pathway, what the competitive landscape looks like. So the goal is to leverage this community very actively to be able to provide guidance and assistance to academics on this sort of journey, particularly because we're actually at a point where we're investing in these projects even before a VC necessarily would, which in my view also provides, could actually play to a strength, because you have this guiding voice quite early on in the development of the project.
And I think that's really important, not just using expertise to pick the projects, but then to, have an ongoing relationship with the projects and providing that kind of support. I think that's going to be really enhance the chances of success. And I'm taking all the time now. I want to bring in Dong Lu, who's my PhD student, who's assembling questions from the audience. What do we have so far?
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, Mr. Golato. There has been a lot of response in the Q&A section. I'm just trying my best to summarize now. So let me just start with some questions about the projects, because it seems like many of our audience are interested in that. So what are the projects that VitaDAO has been funded so far, and what are they? Could you explain more on that?
Yeah, so currently, I mean, VitaDAO launched about 13 weeks ago, maybe 12 weeks ago. So again, it's quite a new organization. It actually just funded its first project, and it's on a large-scale drug repurposing project. So this is basically a project from the University of Copenhagen, from Morten Schabbe-Knudsen, that has actually worked backwards from a lot of human data. So he had access to sort of the Danish healthcare system's medical and prescription record database, which I believe has something like 3.5 billion data points covering 3,500 different prescriptions on something like maybe 8 million people. And what he identified was that there were a certain number of therapeutics, after sort of controlling for a variety of factors, that haven't traditionally been explored or mentioned in the literature to be pro-longevity supporting, similar to what you might see from a metformin. And he's basically working to now work backwards from that human data to test some of these therapeutics, already FDA approved therapeutics, in a variety of model organisms, to try and determine if the mechanism of action there is, let's say, different from what they're currently being prescribed for, if there's a repurposing use case or a method of use case. This is broadly the sort of thing, and this is also obviously becomes, let's say, there's intellectual property challenges associated with this. There'll probably be medical chemistry that's needed to, medicinal chemistry that's needed to actually create something here. But it's also a project that has an incredible amount of value from a longevity perspective, because if there are indeed therapies that are already available, that are within reach, for example, to be able to make a difference for human health span, that's something that would be really valuable to know and to understand. And this represents the sort of class of projects very broadly that we're interested in. It's the things that are maybe a bit more difficult to fund, but have a lot of promise. Anything from really any, if you wanted to think about, aging in terms of the hallmarks, everything is fair game. But what we're interested in is really trying to create something that, so whether it be a drug, a biomarker, a diagnostic, very broadly. Currently, we're evaluating a number of other projects, things that range from sort of immune modification to things like brain cell replacement therapies, things like things that play with temperature, for example, thermogenesis. It's very broad, but we're really, I think the goal at this point is to invest into people with great ideas that would be difficult to fund in the longevity space.
Just to jump in, Morton's been on a prior show, so if anybody wants to go back and hear more about his project, you can find it on YouTube.
Oh, awesome.
So building on that, about the projects that you are funding, what are the challenges that you face that is unique to this research field of longevity in crypto space?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's many challenges that I would say are unique to longevity that other fields don't have to deal with. I mean, one of the least of which or not the least of which is obviously the difficulty of translating into the clinic. So the fact that many of these projects end up needing to sort of define aging by proxy, in essence, through a different indication, I think that's always an interesting challenge. The other components I would say are sort of like there's a lot of different theories around why we age or around where to focus on what's important. Should we be focusing on rejuvenation? Should we be focusing on the mitochondria? Should we be focusing on known classes of geroprotectors or behavioral interventions? I think it's difficult to know in any sort of objective way what the right thing to fund is or what the right area to focus on is. The challenges that, and the way that you solve that, I think, because everyone, if you're an academic in the space, you have your own biases. You have the things that you sort of maybe believe in or evangelize to a certain extent based on your work. And I think the way that you help get around that is by having a really diverse community of researchers that are helping source and evaluate projects. In the context of the intersection between longevity and crypto, I mean, I see the biggest challenge for us is really, and for crypto as well, actually, objectively, I would say, is gaining legitimacy with traditional players. It's I think not wanting to be seen as a crypto organization that, and as I mentioned earlier, having it be perceived that this is a reputable funding body that is making a difference in the longevity space. I think we've been, doing quite well with that in the short time that we've existed, but I certainly think that anytime you mention crypto, it comes with a certain stigma or preconceived notions, which is obviously something that needs to be overcome.
Thank you for your answer, Mr. Golato. So now I'm kind of going to the next topic with regard to the funding organization itself. So there is a question from the audience that mentioned about the decentralized system that VitaDAO is applying. Do you think a decentralized model can reduce efficiency due to the lack of clear direction? For example, there is this audience called Andrew mentioned there might be members that are out of step of the project and maybe just object against the project. How could we cope with that kind of challenge?
Absolutely. This is a great point. So, I mean, I think in a year from now, I will be able to come back relatively concretely and say, here are what DAOs are good at. These are what decentralizations accelerate at. And these are the key problems that need to be solved. I think, something as simple as, let's say, creating an incentive for someone to write an article can become very difficult if you have many people competing for this task, if you have people with different ideas or concepts on what to write about. That said, all of these things can be, because the organization is so flexible and there's this ability to iterate, you can, as a member, I can say, I believe this would be a good process to implement for doing this. And I can make a proposal, and that proposal, if the community is behind it, passes. And now there is a clear process to follow for getting something done in a way that is efficient. it takes time for DAOs to form and for them to find their feet and their way of working. And this is a systemic challenge to any decentralized organization. But I think the trade-off is sort of worth it, right? You have more people, in my opinion, you have more people that have a voice, more people, because of this broad network, a lot of interesting ideas that you would never even really think about surface. You bring together a community of, I don't know, 1,000 smart people. My personal belief is that you'll have a stronger community or a stronger, let's say, value proposition than any single person. But of course, there are trade-offs to that. If you have one person who can make an executive decision, you can typically execute on things really quickly. But yeah, it's a very good point.
We have time for one or two more quick questions, so we need quick answers too.
Okay.
I actually found this very interesting question in the Q&A, which triggers my curiosity too. So Mr. Golato and Prof. Kennedy was mentioning about VitaDAO working with farmers and people with deep pockets. Can't these people or farmers with deep pockets join as members? And if they can they control governance of VitaDAO?
Yeah, so I suppose in theory, a pharmaceutical company could join the DAO. It would be that, there's not a controlling stake in the DAO for sale, for example, like there's a certain number of tokens that are traded on secondary markets for other players. So it would be difficult or near impossible for any organization to come in and have a controlling stake or sort of like, almost have like a coup in the DAO, if you will. And ultimately members can, this is ultimately for the community to decide. So, if a pharmaceutical company came and said, we would like to collaborate with you, the community would have to define the terms on which that is feasible or that makes sense. It's decentralized systems are typically powerful because single entities, you would never be able to take control of the Bitcoin network, for example, or of Ethereum. There's so many holders that are so distributed that it becomes very difficult for any one player, no matter how big your pockets are, to be able to exert a force on that network. It's the same situation here, albeit at a slightly smaller scale, but there's this, I don't want to come off as somebody who is like, I think pharmaceutical companies are incredibly necessary. They play an important role in our world. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm, just inherently anti-pharma. But I think there are certain ways that pharmaceutical companies are motivated or incentivized that need to change. And I'm hoping that VitaDAO can be in some way have a collaboration with pharma that is, let's say, fruitful or that drives, keeps community interest and patient interests at the front and center. But ultimately, any collaboration like that will be up to the members that currently govern the organization.
That's great. Well, I think that's a good place we should end. Thanks a lot, Tyler, and thanks, Donglu. We'll be really excited to see how this develops and maybe bring you back on in a little while and see how it's going. It's relatively easy for people to participate in this. So if you're listening and want to get involved, please do. I want to remind you to use the chat function to make comments about the show or suggestions about future shows. Next week, Andrea Meyer will be back and she will be hosting Diana von Heemst. And then in 2 weeks, I'm going to be having a fireside chat with David Sinclair. So hopefully you'll be on for that. That should be entertaining. We're going to leave you with a final video of a 95-year-old father's reaction when finding out about his age. Thanks again, Tyler, and thanks for joining the show.
How old do you think you are?
79.
Higher.
89.
Higher.
89. Higher than that?
Yeah.
90.
Higher.
91.
Higher.
2.
Higher.
3.
Higher.
4.
Higher.
5.
Higher.
6.
Higher.
7.
Higher.
8.
That's it. 98.
Your ass. I am not 98 years old. Holy that gets so old. How do I get so old so fast?
Time flies when you're having fun.
Oh my God.
You're going to be 99 this summer.
No, am I really?
Yeah.
I was born 1919.
And it's
What is it now?
2018.
1919. 2018. Next year I'll be 100.
Yeah, you're going to be 99 this summer. You're going to be 99 this summer, and then next year will be 100.
Yeah. Holy f***. Jeez, I'm going to be an old f***ing man. You know it?
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down.